Israeli forces raided Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza again on Monday in an operation they called, quote, thwart terrorist activity. The Israeli military says that it killed, quote, 20 terrorists and detained dozens more. The IDF has said that the Israeli military killed Fayek al-Maboob, who they characterize as a senior Hamas commander. However, the government media office in Gaza said that al-Maboob was acting in a purely civilian humanitarian capacity and was in charge of the coordination between tribes in the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, for Palestinian refugees. The dispute may deepen questions about Israel's targeting of food resources, as al-Maboob was reportedly in charge of securing the entry of aid trucks into northern Gaza. Now, reports of gunshots and a fire broke out at the largest medical facility in Gaza early Monday morning. The IDF said in a statement, during the activity, terrorists opened fire at the troops from within the hospital. The troops responded with live fire and hits were identified.
Al Jazeera journalist Ismail Al-Ghul was, quote, severely beaten and detained by Israeli forces during the Al-Shifa raid, according to Al Jazeera. Al-Ghul was at the hospital with his crew and other reporters early Monday to cover the hospital raid. Witnesses say the reporter was dragged away by Israeli forces, who also destroyed the broadcasting vehicles at the facility. After 12 hours in Israeli custody, Al-Ghul and his team were released. Al-Ghul say the journalists were stripped and forced to lie on their stomachs as they were blindfolded and their hands were tied. According to Al Jazeera, Al-Ghul also said the IDF soldiers would open fire to scare them if there was any movement. The Committee to Protect Journalists called the incident a, quote, deliberate attempt to cover up Israeli actions. U.S. State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel responded to an Al Jazeera reporter's questioning on the arrest of his colleague. Let's watch.
We have been very clear that journalists play a vital role and that no journalist should be targeted in order to silence their voices in this conflict or any other. And the circumstances are as such in Gaza, where we believe the journalism and the voices of journalists is more important than ever. But again, as it relates to this specific situation, we've asked for more information, but I don't have any other specific comment on that.
And about Al-Shifa hospital, the ongoing operation, because the arresting happened right before this operation started, and that led us to believe that it is a way to black out what's going on in Al-Shifa complex. Did you hear from your Israeli partners why they are targeting this hospital?
So I'm not going to speak to specific military tactics or assessments or operations from up here. Let me just say two things. First, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, others have made their points quite clear that civilians at hospitals, medical personnel, patients must be protected.
The World Health Organization issued a statement of concern yesterday in response to the raid, saying, quote, hospitals should never be battlegrounds. We are terribly worried about the situation at Al-Shifa Hospital in northern Gaza, which is endangering health workers, patients, and civilians. Hospitals must be protected. Ceasefire. Now, food experts say famine is imminent in the Gaza Strip, and the region is on the verge of a major acceleration of deaths and malnutrition. According to a report from the Global Authority on Food Security and Nutrition, the group, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Global Initiative, has only warned of famine twice before, in Somalia and in 2011 and in South Sudan in 2017, really underscoring the seriousness of the situation. So this all comes on the heels of a really fascinating Washington Post story that just came out this morning that talks about what the apparent knowledge gap was between the White House and Israel, or even more damningly, awareness by the White House at the time that some of these kinds of raids that Israel was enacting, especially in the early days after October 7th, were done without solid intelligence that they were, quote, legitimate military targets. That story coming out on the backs of a second Al-Shifa hospital raid after the initial Al-Shifa hospital raid was so notable because they're in the buildup to it. There were all of these statements made about how this was a Hamas headquarters, that there were masses and miles of tunnels underneath of the hospital that were going to be proven to be to justify in a lot of ways attacking what had become not just a hospital, but a refuge for so many displaced people in Gaza. When that didn't come to fruition, I think it dealt a real blow to people's sense of integrity in the Israeli military efforts. Now, going back into that same hospital, on the backs of a story about how apparently there has been very little intelligence about whether or not some of these civilian targets are legitimate military targets, I think continues to raise questions about whether or not these raids are really calculated to go after Hamas, as is the stated agenda, or whether or not it's part of this broader project that we've witnessed where crucial infrastructure, whether it's hospitals or schools or universities or other public institutions, blocks of housing, et cetera, have been demolished in what some people are characterizing as an effort to ethnically cleanse or prevent the return of Palestinians back to their homes after the conflict is over.
I mean, they did present video footage, right, of Hamas operatives being inside the hospital, if I recall, last time. So they had a justification for attacking the hospital. Whether or not the broader claims of it being a headquarters or central to the military effort, those maybe did not bear out.
Well,
but it was a legitimate target if Hamas was there.
Well, no, it's not, because it's a hospital. So
well, a hospital becomes a legitimate target if it's being used as a ground where the terrorists have gathered.
Right, but that's not what international law says.
That is what international law says.
No, if a person being in a hospital doesn't make it a headquarters for a terrorist organization, right? So that's the problem. I want to read a little bit more from this Washington Post report because I think it really underscores the issue. Because what we frequently have is there's an attack, people die, IDF very clearly puts out its version of events. The mainstream media typically runs with it. Weeks or months later, there's at times, often, frequently a revision of events. But at that point, what is the saying? A lie goes around the world twice before the truth puts on its shoes. It becomes grandfathered into this belief that all of the actions were justified when we now have this reporting. Surprisingly, I'm shocked, frankly, from the Washington Post, acknowledging that the Biden administration had questions about and did not have solid intelligence about the legitimacy of these military targets. Further on down in the article, they write that Kirby added that the White House did not want to see a firefight in the hospital. This is talking about the first Al-Shifa raid. And it was concerned about whether or not it should validate the IDF's framing before the raid, that in fact it was the grounds of a Hamas headquarters, because again, there was not intelligence there to do so. After the raid, this is Van Hollen, had received a classified briefing about the U.S. intelligence on Al-Shifa, said there were, quote, important and subtle differences between what Biden officials were saying publicly and what the intelligence actually showed, saying, quote, I did find there to be some disconnect between the administration's public statements and the classified findings. If it turns out that the Biden administration was aware that there was not, and not just this instance, but other instances, sufficient intelligence to support doing something that is really in contravention of wartime norms, which is conducting a raid on a hospital where, remember, over 30,000 people are sequestered, not just to seek medical aid, but because they are refugees within Gaza at this point and have been for the last 5 months. That's a serious misdirection and misleading of the public.
I mean, I guess, again, we saw footage of Hamas being inside the hospital. They'd also been...
What are you referring to?
They also... there was
who's the Hamas
security
inside the
footage
hospital?
of Hamas terrorists using the hospital,
walking through the hospital.
Yes,
and that to you justifies conducting a raid on one of the few.
It is a war against Hamas. I'm sorry.
All right. So another part of this story that I think is really important is the arrest, detainment, and stripping naked of journalists. The journalists, the Al Jazeera journalists, say that they were in a room that was clearly marked as for journalists, wearing flak jackets and the like. And so the choice to arrest the journalists who have been sent to the hospital to, in fact, cover the hospital is a clear contravention of wartime norms. Remember, this conflict has seen more journalists killed than any other in recent memory. Over 100 UN faculty employees have also been killed at this time. And now there's also this baseline critical question of whether the identity of the person who's identified by the IDF as a member of Hamas is in fact a terrorist, or is it part of this broader characterization we've seen, where because Hamas is the government of Gaza, that everyone who works for the government, whether in their capacity as a police officer or as a trash pickup, et cetera, is seen as a legitimate target. If you see everybody basically who is employed by the government as a legitimate target, then of course there's Hamas in the hospital, and it justifies doing all sorts of things. And I don't want this to get lost in the fray. This particular man, Faik al-Mabou, was apparently in charge of bringing food deliveries, coordinating food deliveries, safe delivery of this ground by ground into northern Gaza, where the starvation is most acute, where the emerging famine is most acute. And so is this part and parcel of what the EU has now come out and said, weaponization of famine as a weapon of war, which again is a war crime.
All right, well, thank you for that. We'll have more Rising right after this.